Well, hello and welcome to our final Zoom session for 120, Anatomy and Physiology of the Ear. Okay, last week we started anew on, on Unit 6, covering the 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system. Today we will finish that unit, and we'll concentrate, of course, on the central auditory nervous system. Last week, if I read in my good old history, what did we do? We did the gross anatomy of the central nervous system, white versus gray areas. We covered nuclei versus tracts, nerves, ganglia, and then we covered the three main areas of the brain stem. So, taking off right from over there, let's do it. We'll go to share screen, make this guy smaller, make the notes there, and the PowerPoints. So, make sure that we know this and that we have this terminology down pat, okay? Make sure we know the difference between a multipolar neuron and a bipolar neuron, okay? Multipolar being muscles, efferent, bipolar being senses, afferent. Again, showing you multipolar neuron on the top, bipolar in the middle, synapses, and this would come into play with the brain stem because we have various stages. There are first order neurons, second order, third order, fourth order, and in English that just means stepping up higher from one nucleus to another paranuclei to another paranuclei in the brain stem. So what we're really going to be looking at today is covering the brain stem itself and these nuclei. We're going to be looking at what these nuclei do. Where are they? What parts of the brain stem, where they are found? So when you're looking at the right, you will see the brain stem highlighted in gray. And then you'll see the cortex of the brain surrounding. Think of the brain as much like your fist. Okay, looking here, how can I do that? This way, okay? So, you could do, this is the church, this is the steeple, open up the door and see all the people. There you go, something silly. So let's go and look at the brain that way, because you are. We're looking inside the auditory areas. You'd have to peel apart this thumb from the rest of the fist. Anyway, we'll get there later. So we're looking at the cochlea, 8th nerve, cochlea, 8th nerve, hitting the brain stem. You've got one pair of nuclei called the cochlear nuclei, which lie on the surface of the brain stem. Then you have another pair of nuclei called the superior olivary complexes. They lie deep inside the brain stem. Then higher up, another pair of nuclei called the lateral lemniscus. Higher up, another pair of nuclei called the inferior colliculus. And then you're leaving the brain stem and getting to what we call the thalamus, medial geniculate bodies. And then off to the right and left auditory cortex. And this is the auditory cortex, is right where I'm drawing my cursor, right in that slit right there. That's what you'd have to pull apart in order to see it. And that's called Heschl's gyrus. Heschl's, H-E-S-C-H-E-L, Heschl's gyrus. So, looking also at the brain stem, look at the brain this way. This is a schematic. Now you're looking at it, a sagittal cut, which is kind of thinking like this, a sagittal, right down the center. Okay? You can see the cortex. Then you'll see this big white area. Then you'll see a dark area here, and then white area here, the brain stem containing inside all these nuclei. Rather interesting. Then you have the cerebellum here for fine motor control. You have three main parts to the brain: brain stem, cerebellum, cerebrum. Brain stem, cerebellum, cerebrum. Brain stem is critical to life. It's your primitive brain, fight or flight, heartbeat, breathing, body temperature, reflexes, Cerebellum, fine motor control. Cerebrum, integration of thought processes and behaviors. So now you're looking flipped around. It's just flipped around to the other side. Okay, this area is called the corpus callosum. It's a big white area of the brain. Corpus callosum. Corpus being body, callosum, callus, being hard. When anatomists would put their hand down the fissure, the central slice, the central fissure of the brain, they would thunk, thunk, hit a hard body, and that was this. We'll talk about that later. Here's another way. This is a coronal section, slicing this way. And here's that slit I was talking about. When anatomists would put their fingers in that slit, they would thunk, thunk, hit this hard body. Corpus callosum, looking at it that way. Corpus callosum, looking at it sagittally or coronally. Okay? Now, here is the 8th nerve hitting the brain stem. And what part of the brain stem does it hit? The cochlear nucleus. Each 8th nerve. Left 8th nerve hits the left cochlear nucleus. Right 8th nerve hits the right cochlear nucleus on the sides of the brain stem. And as soon as they do meet, there is a real plethora, an explosion of types of cells. Basket cells, octopus cells, granulate cells, all these weird looking cells. Anyway, so here's your brain stem from the front. From the front, okay, as facing you. 3 parts we covered last week. The bottom, the medulla, the middle, the pons, the upper being the midbrain. Here's looking at the back. Medulla, pons, midbrain. So what's in these parts? Whoops. Cochlear nucleus is at the junction of the pons and the medulla. You'll see the vestibulo-acoustic nerve, the 8th nerve. Where does it meet? At the junction. And this would be the cochlear nucleus area, right there. Superior olivary complex, buried deeper inside. Lateral meniscus, and then inferior colliculi in the midbrain. Look at the next picture, the 4 bumps. Superior colliculi, inferior colliculi. The superior are for vision, the inferior are for hearing. This is the first unity of vision and hearing in the brain. Okay? What's interesting to note is that the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside, the gray matter is on the inside. What's white matter? Fatty lipid content. Think of insulation around a wire. And what's the gray areas? The cell bodies that are not myelinated. The myelin is the white fatty lipid insulation on the outside. The gray matter is the unmyelinated cell bodies. So when you get toward the brain, things invert. Now the white matter's inside and the gray matter's outside. And that flipping, that change takes place in the brain stem. But for now, let's go to our notes and let's look at these pieces and parts. Page 1 we've covered, page 2 we've covered, page 3, central auditory nervous system. Let us read. CANS, auditory areas in the brain stem and brain itself, consists of pairs of nuclei or groups of neuron cell bodies, gray, linked by tracts, white. To make sure we have a handle on it, let's look at this here. Over to here. The gray areas would be the nuclei, and the arrows would be the white tracts within the brainstem. Back to the notes. Auditory areas, each area consists of pairs of nuclei. Each nucleus is tonotopic. Specific frequencies are represented in specific places, just like in the eighth nerve and just like in the cochlea. Lots of decussation, lots of crossover from side to side. Brainstem is simply the spinal cord inside the cranium. It has three parts, the midbrain being the top, the pons being the middle, the bulb in other words, and the medulla being the bottom. Cochlear nucleus, first gray area. Right and left eighth nerves go to right and left cochlear nucleus. They lie on the brainstem surface at the pontomedullary junction. I'm just reading right here. The cochlear nucleus is important for mental image of the distance of sound. Think of an owl in a barn, hearing a mouse somewhere in the hay, getting sort of a mental idea of the distance of the sound. Decussation begins. Tracts go from cochlear nucleus both to the ipsilateral, being same side, and contralateral, superior olivary complexes. Let's look in our picture. Cochlear nuclei to ipsilateral and contralateral SOCs, superior olivary complexes. Okay, there's a cough for you. Here's another schematic. You can look at it this way. They've enlarged the brainstem and they made the cortex of the brain really small, just to highlight these nuclei, these pairs of nuclei. Here's your cochleas, eighth nerve, cochlear nucleus, and then look at this, to the ipsilateral superior olivary complex and the contralateral. See? Ipsi, contra. Same here, ipsi, contra. That's your first crossover. So what's the first pair of nuclei to receive input from both ears? This SOC is getting information from right and left ears. This SOC is getting information from right and left ears. Each one has now information from both ears. So follow the arrows. Cochlea, eighth nerve, cochlear nucleus, ipsilateral SOC, contralateral SOC. And then moving on up and up and up. Lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, medial geniculate bodies, thalamus. So which of these areas is brainstem? Well, these two would be the bottom of the pons, because where does the eighth nerve meet the brainstem? At the pontomedullary junction. These are at the bottom of the pons. Sounds like the bottom of the pond, okay? Lateral lemniscus, also in the pons. And then where's the inferior colliculi? Where's the inferior colliculus? Midbrain, top of the brainstem. Medial geniculate bodies, okay, MGBs, thalamus. And then HG, Heschel's gyrus, inside. See that little flap? You'd have to open it up. That's what I was telling you. You'd have to peel that away, opening it up to see the auditory areas inside. Okay, so this little slit here would be akin to, well, where would it be? Here. And see if I've got a picture of it. I'll just keep flipping. Here, look at that. Okay, that's what I'm trying to highlight. Brainstem, cerebellum, temporal lobe, which is the sides of the brain. You have to peel that away, opening it up to see Heschel's gyrus inside. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain, occipital portion of the brain, and so on. Let's go back to our notes, because we've hit the second pair of nuclei, which is really quite a humdinger. I'm going to gray this up so we see it close, pull it up so it's bigger, and let's look at this pair of nuclei, because they are very important. The right and left superior olivary complexes receive information from same ipsilateral and opposite contralateral cochlear nuclei. The SOC is therefore the first place to receive info from both ears due to decussation. All binaural interaction thus involves this pair of nuclei. They're actually involved in three things. So let's count them one by one. First, they are involved in the acoustic reflexes and the acoustic reflex arc. Now, if you think about the acoustic reflex arc, I'm going to make this small. I'm going to go to here, and let's pull up our pictures of the acoustic reflex arc. I'm going to just pull up Unit 3 PowerPoint. Way back when we covered the middle ear. And let's see if we've got that thing down. Where have we got it? Acoustic reflex. Ah, here it is. I had it and I passed it. Whoa, I keep jumping past it. Here. So take a peek at this. Afferent, loud incoming sound. Ear canal, eardrum, middle ear, cochlea. Which part of the cochlea? Inner hair cells. Follow my cursor. Eighth nerve, cochlear nucleus, SOCs. I draw them down, but mainly to get the idea that they're deeper inside. Okay? SOCs. And notice, it's going to go to the same SOC, but also to the opposite SOC. That's why then from the SOCs, you've got the fifth nerve and the seventh cranial nerve. Fifth nerve going to the tensor tympani muscle, seventh cranial nerve going to the stapedius muscle, and there's the acoustic reflex arc. And notice a loud sound in one ear creates an acoustic reflex in both ears. The tightening of the middle ear bones due to a loud sound. Look at all the area that the acoustic reflex arc covers. Huge area. I mean, a monstrous area. It's just covering everything. Covers the whole ear, everything except the cortex. But everything else, it's a large area. Back to our SOC notes and back to here. So they're involved in the acoustic reflexes and acoustic reflex arc. The acoustic reflex occurs in both ears even though one ear is loudly stimulated. Why? Due to decussation or crossover. Number 2, directionality of sound that we've covered in 110 psychoacoustics. Localization of sound involves the SOCs. Those are the ones comparing the time of arrival, as we're hinting here, versus the intensity. Okay? They're comparing the time of arrival from one ear to the other. So if I have, my head is like this, and you are talking to me, I'll stop sharing here. So if I'm like this, and you're talking to me, the sound is going to hit my left ear a split second before it hits my right ear. And your two SOCs are comparing. Oh, when did you get that? When did you get the sound? Okay. When did you get the sound? When did you get? Okay. So they're comparing the time of arrival to help you localize the direction of low frequency sounds. And they can use time of arrival because low frequencies have long sound waves, and long sound waves bend. So they will bend around from hitting here. It will bend around and hit this ear. But it'll hit this ear, opposite ear, a split second later than this ear. So that's what's going to help me localize the direction of low frequency sounds. High frequency waves are short, and highs bounce. We learned about that in acoustics as well. Even this morning, when we talked about feedback in hearing aids, highs bounce, they leak out. So I can't use my SOCs, cannot use the cue of time of arrival because highs don't bend around, so they can't use the time of arrival of the sounds between the ears. They can't compare time of arrival because highs bounce, so they're not going to bend around the head. Rather, the SOCs have to rely on a different cue, And that different cue is tiny intensity differences between the ears. So if my head is like this and you're talking to me from over there, the intensity of your voice is slightly louder to this ear than it is to this ear, because my right ear is in the head shadow. Okay? So it's being blocked a little bit. And where is that cutoff between low and high frequencies? Around 1500 to 2000 hertz. It's that little range of frequencies that my SOCs do not know which cue to use. They don't know whether to switch from time of arrival to tiny intensity differences. They sometimes call that the cone of confusion. That's the area that's most difficult to localize the direction. But in basics, to be basic, it's your SOCs are using tiny time differences between the ears as the cue for localizing the direction of low frequency sounds, and they're using, excuse me, tiny intensity differences to compare to localize the direction of high frequency sounds. So your SRCs are doing quite a lot of their interesting pair of nuclei. The third thing that the SOCs are involved with is the Olivocochlear Bundle, the nerve that runs back from the brain stem to the outer hair cells. Recall, the eighth nerve is primarily an inner hair cell phenomenon. The eighth nerve is a sensory nerve, and inner hair cells are the sensory cells. They're sending information to the eighth nerve. Okay, so it's the inner hair cells that are afferent. The outer hair cells are efferent. They're the muscular motors. They're the ones that are sharpening the peak of the traveling wave and amplifying the peak of the traveling wave. They are the motoric muscles of the cochlea. So they are getting messages from the brain. And the nerve that talks to them is the Olivocochlear Bundle. And it runs from, guess where? Its cell bodies are in the Olivocochlear Bundle, and the axon runs out to the outer hair cells. So that's going to be a multipolar neuron, okay, or nerve, whereas made of millions, or I should say thousands of multi-neuron fibers. In fact, I think there are 1,800 fibers in the Olivocochlear Bundle, 1800. How many outer hair cells do you have in each cochlea? 12,000. So 12,000 outer hair cells have to share 1,800 Olivocochlear Bundle fibers. So the whole innervation pattern is very different. How many inner hair cells do you have in each cochlea? 3,000. How many eighth nerve fibers do you have? 30,000. So each inner hair cell gets 10 eighth nerve fibers. So the whole innervation pattern is different between inners and outer hair cells, showing you that inner hair cells are afferent and outer hair cells are motoric efferent. Inners are brain going, outers are brain sending. So outer hair cells help the inner hair cells pick up soft sounds. Eighth nerve, Olivocochlear Bundle. And the Olivocochlear Bundle is very, very thin. Small little country bumpkin road compared to the great big superhighway of the eighth nerve. Okay? But those are the three things that the SOCs are involved with. They're a very important pair of nuclei. Highly useful. So that's this second pair of nuclei, S superior olives. You're going to like the lateral lemniscus. You know why? We don't know what it does. There you go. Next. We don't know exactly what the role of the lateral lemniscus is. Next, leaving the pons now, going up to the midbrain, which is the top of the brain stem. The largest auditory brain stem center forms two mounds. Colliculus is Latin for hill. Okay? Inferior colliculus. They call them inferior because, as we said earlier, they are literally located, if you're looking at the brain, you're looking at the brain stem itself from the back, you'll see four mounds. Superior colliculi, inferior colliculi. Superior are vision, inferior are hearing. All right. Back to the notes. What do? Recall the eighth nerve is 1 inch in length. The distance from the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction to the inferior colliculus is also an inch. That's a good thing to remember. How long is it from the bottom of the brainstem to the top of the brainstem? 1 inch. In other words, how long is this area here? From here to here. Okay, from where the eighth nerve meets the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction to the midbrain where the inferior colliculi are located. That distance is 1 inch, same as the length of the eighth nerve. Superior colliculi, SC, looks like 2 more hills right above the inferior, a visual center that receives auditory input. IC and SCs thus integrate visual and auditory information. So now you not only know the direction of sound from the SOCs, but now your eyes are snapping in the direction the sound is coming from. You get it? You get it? All right. So the inferior colliculus is also important for sound localization, controls eyes and head turning toward direction of sound. Good. Now we've got to leave the brainstem and get higher. Let's get higher. Okay. Look at this picture here. I'll pull it up closer. Okay. Medulla, pons, eighth nerve would hit here. Cochlear nuclei, SOCs, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculi, and look above it right here. Thalamus. The area below the corpus callosum and above the brain stem. Now the thalamus, you can sweetly and interestingly think of as it's the grand central train station for all sensory input, except smell. We do not know how smell works, but taste, touch, vision, hearing, all of those senses integrate at the level of the thalamus. That's the meeting place for all senses, sensory information. Good. Okay. Again, medulla, pons, midbrain, thalamus, corpus callosum, cerebrum or cortex. Again, I guess if you were drawing the corpus callosum on this one here, it would be here, right there. Okay, when the anatomist would put their hand into the crack of the brain, thunk, they hit that bottom part, corpus callosum. So here just showing you a side view of the brain and a coronal view, split this way, okay? So this picture here is a lot like this picture here. Okay, so let's kind of look at the side versus coronal area. This is that thumb, again, the main part, the crack, the temporal lobe, the primary auditory cortex in that crack. It is called Heschl's gyrus. Heschl's gyrus. If you're looking at a coronal section of the brain, here's your central fissure. The bottom here where my cursor is would be the corpus callosum. And here's this, what they call the Sylvian fissure. And peeling it apart, you'll see the primary auditory cortex of both sides of the brain, right and left. Heschl's gyrus. Go to our notes, make sure we're following right along here. Medial geniculate bodies, another gray area. We're not exactly sure of its role regarding hearing, but it's located in the auditory part of the thalamus. The thalamus is a grand central station for all sensory information except smell. The thalamus is located just below the corpus callosum, only about another inch above the inferior colliculus. And then Heschl's gyrus, or primary auditory cortex, a gray area buried deep inside each temporal lobe. You need to pull apart the sylvian fissure to see it. And look at this in italics. It's bigger in the left than in the right in most people. So the left temporal lobe is usually dominant for speech in most people. It is a cortical area. Therefore, it's the first area of auditory perception or conscious auditory awareness. Recall, the areas below only give reflexive responses. Hessel's gyrus sends information to auditory association areas. What the heck is that? Auditory association areas. Lots of interneurons, lots of tiny, it's still in the cortex, still in the temporal lobe area, okay? Still keep there, stay there, okay? That's where all speech, language, and hearing is located, is the sides of the brain. Occipital is vision, speech and language and hearing, the right and left temporal lobes. Heschel's gyrus is that area deep inside the sylvian fissure. That's the primary auditory area. And then you have bunches of smaller associative auditory areas surrounding Heschel's gyrus. And that's what we're talking about here. Lots of interneurons containing connections of hearing to speech and language, reading and writing. Broca's area, Wernicke's area. Let's look at those puppies. I wonder if I've got a picture of them. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe rain, maybe snow. Let's look. I'm not really sure. I don't think I do. So basically what I'm going to do is just show you here. It's easier. Okay? Broca's area is right here. Right there. Okay? You'll see a central sulcus. Do you see that? This central fissure where my cursor is. So you studied the longitudinal fissure, the sylvian fissure, which is this one here. And then you'll have a central sulcus or a central fissure down the side of the brain. This is called the motor strip. This is called the sensory strip. Now the motor strip represents all the muscles of the body. Okay, the legs, the arms, all your torso, all muscular movements of the body, and the bottom of it controls your mouth. Okay, the top of it controls your legs, and the middle part controls your arms. And this strip right here, that's called the sensory strip, and the bottom of it gets sensations from the mouth. And the middle gets sensations from the arm. And the top gets sensations from the legs. Okay, so sensory strip, motor strip. At the bottom of the motor strip there is Broca's area. Now, if that gets damaged, the person has Broca's aphasia. Let's read it. Causes disfluent stroke or aphasia. The person knows what he wants to say, just has trouble motorically moving his mouth in order to move his tongue to say it. It's kind of a hard time, but knows what he wants. Okay, can write it down, so knows the language, has full control of his brain, just can't control the motor movements of the mouth, so has a hard time speaking. Now, if you look at the other kind, okay, if I look at Wernicke's aphasia or stroke, a stroke or aphasia, okay, same thing. Wernicke's is different. Wernicke's is due to damage over here, more toward the back, right here. This would be Wernicke's area. Now, if you've got damage to that area of the brain, you have a much sadder kind of stroke, because your stroke is called a fluent type. You can talk all right. Oh, you have no problem, but you just don't always make sense. Your language is affected more than your speech. Okay, Broca's area is mostly speech. Wernicke's area is more like language. So in a way, that's a sadder type of aphasia. You might see this on some people who've had a stroke. They're mumbling away, they're talking away, they can speak, but it's just gibberish. You're not making any sense. So anyway, that's just kind of giving you just a smattering of an idea of some of the areas that are related to the Heschel's gyrus, the primary auditory cortex, and then you have the associative auditory areas. Broca's area, Wernicke's area, the bottom of the sensory strip, bottom of the motor strip, all of that stuff, okay? Now let's get to the punch here so we can finish our Zoom session and be done with 120 in this lovely semester, okay? So if we go here, whoops, I don't think I want that, but if we go to talking here, all right, here we go. So let's talk about the last area. Let's look at the corpus callosum and what it does. The corpus callosum is like a bridge that connects the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So we've covered Heschel's gyrus, Broca's area, Wernicke's area. Now we're going to look more at the bridge that links the hemispheres of the brain. Now that bridge is a white area. There are no cell bodies in there. So there is no real thought taking place there. I'm going to just make that out of the way and blow it up now. Let's look at the corpus callosum more closely. The callosum more closely. There you go. Here I'm bringing you up a picture of a coronal section of the brain once again. Now, if you're looking here, you'll see a typo, and I'll point it out to you. But let's follow what's happening in this picture. I'll blow it up even larger here. Okay, eighth nerve from the cochlea, where my cursor is, from the cochlea. Okay, you're getting to the cochlear nucleus, and then you've got the crossover happening. They're not showing you the superior olivary complexes. They're not showing you the lateral and meniscus pair of nuclei, but they're showing you the crossover that took place. Inferior colliculus, those pair of nuclei, medial geniculate bodies, thalamus, this is thalamus area, corpus callosum. Again, anatomists putting their fingers in the longitudinal fissure, encountering thunk, thunk, the hard body. Here's the Sylvian fissure, and I believe they've got a bit of a mistake here. They're showing as if Heschel's gyrus is larger, but they're showing you right hemisphere, and this should read left. Okay, this here shows left hemisphere. It should show right. Okay, Heschel's gyrus is larger in the left temporal lobe than it is in the right temporal lobe. Remember, the left side is dominant in most people for speech and language, especially for right-handers. If you're a left-hander, you're better off if you have a stroke, because most strokes take place on the left side of the brain, and they ruin this area. But if you're a left-hander, if you're a southpaw, you've got a more equal representation of speech and hearing in both areas, both sides. Right-handers really have it more in the left. It's not like left-handers will have it in the right. It's just a little bit more equally spread that way. Anyway, look at the two crossovers here. You have one crossover taking place in the low brainstem, and you have another crossover taking place at the level of the corpus callosum. Okay, so you have two crossovers, one straight from the ears, brain stem crossing over to the other side, and the other crossover is a connection between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. All right, here's another picture showing you the same thing. In black, your outer ear, ear canal, middle ear, eustachian tube, cochlea, eighth nerve, brainstem, cochlear nucleus, superior olivary complexes, note the crossover, going up inferior colliculi, inferior colliculus right, inferior colliculus left, which have you. And then medial geniculate bodies, thalamus, this area that I'm circling right here, thalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla. See the medulla? Okay, pons, midbrain, thalamus, and then radiating out to Heschel's gyrus. Radiating out to Heschel's gyrus. Remember, this is a coronal cut. And there's that longitudinal fissure again. Thunk, here's the corpus callosum. So you have two crossovers, one here and one here. Good, hang on there. Here's a test of what they do on children with learning disabilities. Because now you've entered the area no longer of hearing, but of listening. Okay? You can see, you're just not looking. You can hear, you're just not listening. And now you're involving the cortex, paying attention, focusing on what the teacher says. Now here's something interesting. They call it, some teachers call it learning disabilities. A psychologist may call it attention deficit disorder, ADD, or attention hyperactivity deficit disorder, or what have you, ADHD. It's a attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Or an audiologist who went to Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri, and graduated with an AUD degree. They may test these children, and they will label the same child as CAPD, Central Auditory Processing Disorder. Okay, so learning disabilities, ADD, ADHD, CAPD, they're all kind of a messy jumble of terms, but the thing is they are labels, and labels stick. Okay, and many children who are labeled as learning disabled aren't. Okay, sometimes it's a bit overdiagnosed, but let's look at a picture here. Here's a test that audiologists do for children suspected of learning disabilities. Here goes. The dichotic digits test. They'll put pairs of digits into the ears, and guess they call it dichotic. What remember? Monotic. Diotic means same stimuli to both ears at the same time. Dichotic means different stimuli to the ears at the same time. And dichotic can be very, very, very nerve-wracking. Think of if you're trying to talk on the phone to a relative who's coming in out of town, and the person's trying to find directions to your house, and you're talking on the phone and your spouse is yelling at you, no, that's the wrong thing, tell him to go. That's dichotic listening. You're getting different stimuli to each ear, and it's very taxing. That's why they do it. A chain is as strong as its weakest link, and they want to expose a breakdown in the chain. So here's what they're doing. They'll present pairs of digits and ask the kid to repeat the pairs. You don't need to report the order, but the kid's going to hear 1 and 4 at the same time, 1, 4, and 6, 9. 6, 9, okay, dichotic. They'll use numbers between 1 and 10, except 7, because 7 has 2 syllables. All the other numbers have 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. Okay, here it goes. They won't use 0, this is 2 syllables. So pairs of digits, read the bottom, from 0 to 10 except 7, presented simultaneously to both ears. Now, what is the assumption behind the dichotic digits test? Here it goes. Write it down. Gonna ask. Okay, 2 assumptions. Number 1, the left temporal lobe in blue is dominant for language. The second assumption is during dichotic listening, and only during dichotic listening, not during any other situation, but only when you're getting competing information to both ears, okay? Look at the pathways you've got. You've got from the ear going ipsilaterally up and contralateral, right? What does the right cochlear nucleus sends info ipsilaterally to the SOC above it, but also contralaterally to the superior olivary complex on the opposite side. And the left cochlear nucleus sends information to its same superior olivary complex just above it, and also to the opposite one. Okay, so you've got ipsilateral and contralateral information going. And I'll stop sharing and really highlight that. You've got ipsilateral information going from one pit stop to the next, but also contralateral. Okay, now during dichotic listening, and only during dichotic listening, the ipsilateral pathways are suppressed. They're no longer part of the picture. And all you've got is contra. So here goes. Information from my right ear goes contralaterally straight over to my dominant left temporal lobe. Whereas information to my left ear goes to my non-dominant right temporal lobe, and then it has to cross over the corpus callosum to get to the left temporal lobe. So the right ear pathway is shorter than the left, and that's why the left loses. And the kid can repeat more of the digits that were presented to the right ear and cannot repeat the digits that were presented much to his left ear. The child ends up with what's called a right ear advantage. And who's going to have that is going to be especially someone with a poorly formed corpus callosum. The weaker the corpus callosum is as a tract, T-R-A-C-T, there's no cell bodies, it's white. And it's one of the biggest tracts in the body. It's the last to myelinate. It's the last to get done. Okay? So in young kids, this is not formally finished. It only finishes at around in your teenage years. It finishes myelinating. And let's just make sure we look at that corpus callosum a little bit better here. Let's make sure we really get it here. Look at it. See how white it is? And there's no thought process here. It's just information crossing over. It allows crossover from this hemisphere to the one on the other side here, okay? It just allows crossover of that information. And if it isn't fully finished or myelinated, well, then you are really going to experience a big lag in the time of arrival, okay? Then you're really going to have a right ear advantage because this is going to the non-dominant hemisphere and it's crossing over a poorly myelinated corpus callosum to get to the left temporal lobe. So the weaker or the smaller your corpus callosum is, the longer the delay. And they say that in little boys, this can sometimes mature later than in little girls. And girls are usually ahead in the language arts anyway. Let's talk turkey here. Girls learn to talk before boys do. In speech pathologists, when they're testing children for language abilities, they have a different set of norms for little girls than they do for little boys. Boys are more delayed. Boys have a different brain. Boys mature later than girls do too. So the corpus callosum in the boy may not be as developed as the corpus callosum is in the girl. Maybe you can look at it in a general way and almost in a humorous way. Women can multitask better than men. Okay? Both sides of the hemispheres, corpus callosum sharing. Men are more focused on one thing. Okay? A poorly myelinated corpus callosum. Well, wait until the child matures and that right ear advantage will disappear. Okay? Well, how did they find this out? They found this out in Montreal, in Canada. There was a surgeon that severed the corpus callosum to stop seizures. Just kind of sliced through it. And then they did dichotic digits testing on normal people. Get away, box. Whoa! And you'll see a slight right ear advantage in normal hearing people. And then when the left temporal lobe is affected, you know, you're going to have the same kind of thing, a problem. It's not quite as good. But when they split the corpus callosum, huge right ear advantage in dichotic listening. That's why they got the idea that what's involved here isn't so much the brain, it's the corpus callosum that isn't as developed. And a lot of times we talk about the validity of a test. Is it testing what it says it's testing? Well, is the dichotic test really testing learning disabilities? Or is it testing the maturity of the corpus callosum? And if it's testing the maturity of the corpus callosum, is it kind of testing gender? Maybe it's testing gender. Maybe it isn't really testing what it says it's testing. And I can give you kind of a picture of this. Think 40,000 years ago. It's nighttime, and the cave people are sitting around the fire. But who's sitting around the fire? The women and the children. Who's facing away from the fire, not listening? Who's facing away from the fire with spears in their hand? The men. They're doing anything but listening. Okay, they're focused on something else. It's a sad thing when you see people labeled too quickly, because then they start to think they're stupid, and then they hang around in malls and get into trouble playing video games and wearing upside down cross earrings and all that stuff. And then they get busted for this and that, and then they go to juvenile detention center, and finally a judge puts the kid in the army and says, we're going to give you a strict routine, you're getting 3 square meals a day, and you're going to boot camp. The kid goes to boot camp and thrives on it, and ends up becoming one of the best helicopter pilots in the world, because he's good at localizing things in space. He's good at video games. He's good at catching a football. He knows where something, he's got just a different brain. He doesn't color within the lines. And we're all kind of different. It's a bit of a rainbow out there. You got girly girls, you got tomboys, you got effeminate guys, and you got guys. Okay, there's a spectrum out there. And people are all different, thank God. So when you're talking, central auditory processing disorders, I find at times it's overdiagnosed, and it's usually boys, usually. But that's my little stump speech. I kind of end a lot on that one. But I really think that's, so what we've been talking about here is mostly the difference between listening and hearing. But looking at our notes here, again, this is where our notes finish off. Okay, so this basically, I would put a star by this right here, and really make sure you look at those 2 assumptions. But it's just kind of an interesting test. It's one of the only tests done by audiologists. The HIS does not do these tests, okay? This is not in our scope of practice. We fit adults with hearing aids, but the audiologist is trained as well. They'll take a whole course in it called Central Auditory Processing Dysfunction, okay? Basically, we now have finished Unit 7, or 6, I should say, the 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system. This is our last Zoom session for 120, anatomy and physiology. We've covered the 8th nerve pathology. The 8th nerve is the shortest of all the 12 cranial pairs of nerves. How many pairs of cranial nerves do you have? 12. Is the 8th nerve part of the central auditory nervous system or the peripheral? Peripheral. How come? Because what's the central? The brain and spinal cord. Everything else is peripheral. So even though the 8th nerve is in the cranium, it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Then we get to talking about multipolar versus bipolar. Bipolar neurons have 2 long arms. Multipolar neurons have many, many arms and 1 long axon. Multipolar neurons are motor. Bipolar neurons are sensory. The 8th nerve has 30,000 fibers, and each inner hair cell gets 10 of the 8th nerve fibers. We talked about tuning curves that show that the 8th nerve is tonotopic, just like is the cochlea. Then we go to the brain stem, and you've covered 4 main pairs of nuclei, the cochlear nuclei, the superior olivary complexes, the lateral lemniscus pair of nuclei, the inferior colliculus pair of nuclei. Then we leave the brainstem and we get to the thalamus, where you're looking at the medial geniculate bodies. And then we radiate out to Heschel's gyrus, which is the primary auditory cortex. And then from there we radiate out to associative auditory cortex. And I gave you two other areas called Broca's area versus Wernicke's area. One involves speech, one involves more language. So, and then we terminated with a little discussion about central auditory processing disorders, CAPD, sometimes a bit overdiagnosed. Eighth nerve tumors, back to that, remember, that's called retrocochlear pathology. It's usually manifested by a unilateral sensory neural loss. It is a red flag. You need to refer and send to a doctor or to an ENT or to an audiologist for further testing. Case history is important because maybe it's Meniere's disease. That's going to be in one ear. Could be noise exposure more to one ear. So not all asymmetrical sensory neural losses are eighth nerve, but that's what you've got to rule out. That's what you've got to find out. You take a case history, then you do your audiometry, and you'll find that out. Some of you who are taking 130 are learning audiometry now, and some of you are waiting to take that next year. So at any rate, 130 you'll probably take then in the fall, but that's audiometry. I believe it is, yeah. I think 140 is hearing aids. So anyway, 110 acoustics, 120 anatomy, 130 audiometry, 140 hearing aid components. Cool. Good set of courses to take. The early ones. Anyway, I'm hoping that we've all watched this Zoom session. I'm hoping that we all learned something from it. It's been a bit of a slice, but I will be done here. Okay? Eighth nerve tumors are benign, but they can be fatal. So remember to watch yesterday's or last Zoom session and the one before. The last 3 Zoom sessions were on this unit, Unit 6, central auditory nervous system and eighth nerve. Adios. Live long and prosper. I will stop recording now. See you when we look at you.